All right. All right. Well, thanks for hopping on the Code Review Weekly Workshop. Um, we're going to talk about some code review stuff and potentially things adjacent and pertaining to code review. And it sounds like Chad may have something that is adjacent. What's up?
So my meta question is like with the remote development, where we've been working on this integration branch, we're going to be having a bunch of MRs, hopefully not a ton, but a lot of small MRs ready for review. And I want to try to, even though I've been here going on 3.5 years, I've not worked in the monolith a lot. I've like worked out of the monolith and I've worked in isolated, corners of the monolith. So I'm not familiar with a lot of the review guidelines and standards, especially around like authorization, the nuances of database reviews, error logging, metrics, all sorts of stuff like that. So my question is that I know there's a lot of documentation in the docs.gitlab.com around code reviews, and then there's like a bunch of front-end docs, some back-end stuff, some stuff around GraphQL. There's also some stuff littered in the handbook. There's a lot of tribal knowledge that doesn't exist in either of those places. Like if I'm wanting to do a self-review of this MR and I'm like, I want to try to make sure this is good so I don't waste the reviewer's time, but I really don't know what is good or what's not, or what rules we have, or even where to look for them other than just like randomly searching the docs in the handbook for some strings or the reviewer guide section. But I'm sure there's like maybe other stuff or stuff that I'm missing. How can I find all that?
That's a good question.
And have a good confidence that I found the important things.
And what do you think, Yannick?
I think it's an absolute fantastic, but also a super tricky question. I feel it's very hard to answer if we don't boil it on a specific topic. Speaking about the front end, for example, like that is something that is coming to my mind. There is in the handbook, I suppose it is. I'll search for it in a second. I think it's
in the docs.
Yeah, docs. Okay, yeah, front end guidelines. So that is something that's coming to my mind, which is like a collection of best practices in a way. And I would argue.
And I think the front end is much better organized than the back end, to be honest.
Okay. Okay. So that is
in that area.
So that's something that's coming to my mind where I'd be like, okay, sticking to those, that's probably a good start. On the other hand, whatever you're working on is probably very specific. So there's always going to be one side of the gap. I'd argue. If not, then we probably wouldn't need any reviews. So yeah, probably nothing that can be answered completely, but the front-end guidelines is something that I can think of. That's the first thing coming to my mind. Anything else that's coming to your mind, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's challenging because the docs are so large. I mean, you have not only docs about how to review, but docs as the single source of truth for our developer guidelines, which are so large.
Right, which don't exist in the same place. They're like in kind of all under the contribute thing of the top level category of the docs, but under there it's like who knows.
Yeah. That I think the best use of your time and reviewers' time is I mean, this is we've talked about this before, but ideally the code that already exists in the code base is ideally that's up to date, and as long as we look like existing code, then we're good. If that code that's we're inspired from is not up to date, then yeah, you're going to get a whole bunch of comments of like, oh, that can be frustrating. But what can be really helpful in a MR, if I'm just not sure, I kind of lean towards, I don't recommend like just trying to follow developer guidelines to the T, because a lot of linting and everything should solve that. As long as we're not building things that are coupled and things are simple functions, like those are the great place to start. And linting is kind of what guides what should be enforcing the developer guidelines as much as possible. But then if I've built something, then leaving some artifact somewhere of like, hey, this is inspired from this other bit of code. Like, even if that's just a comment on the MR or in the MR description. And when I ping people of like, hey, I did this, this is my process of how I got here. But I kind of want to show the reviewer as if we paired on it, like they could see the story of this is how I got to here. And the easier you can make the reviewer come to that journey with you of like the more I think confident they'll feel about some of the changes and being able to understand the changes.
Yeah. And I always default to the cargo culting approach, like you said, but it's like things aren't always the same. And like I try to find a recent one, and by somebody that I feel confident that they that they did it well and follow most, and they're, you know, it was well reviewed. But still, so I guess follow-on question. Those are good answers. Thank you. If there's something that is done, and I think this is even explicitly said in a doc somewhere, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Like there's not a linting rule for it, and there's nothing in the docs or the review guidelines that say you can't do it that way. Is it okay to push back to the reviewer and say, no, this is sort of how I want it? Even a maintainer.
I would argue yes. And yes, as if in like nobody should decline anything for the reason because I don't like it that way. Like that is absolutely not a good reason. And if I put myself into the shoes as the maintainer in such a case, then I would think it's perfectly fine to ask for you to be like, well, okay, glad that you don't like it, but please update the docs now. And we're going to be having this discussion over there. So yeah, it's absolutely fair to have a strong opinion on something. I don't think it's the greatest idea to have a strong undocumented opinion on something. So
right.
Yeah, as a single source of truth, I would then argue like if it's not in the docs, it's not true. And if it's still true, it should be in the docs. That's kind of what it, maybe a little extreme, but somewhere along those lines, that's where I would take it.
Right. So if there's something you know that you're going to get pushback on, you need to make sure you get it in the docs first so you can point to it, which is like the one that I've had in the past, and I've had feedback on this, like for RubyMine, I really like, I have a scope set up that's like, here's all of the remote development stuff, you know, the couple 3 dozen files. And then I use the code inspection, which like tells me any errors, not only the built-in liners, rubocopy, ESLint, prettier, all of that, but also some built-in ones. But it's not perfect. Like sometimes it says, hey, I can't find this, you know, automatically derived variable that's coming from active record based off of your field. Like its indexing is a little bit off. And I have to say, hey, I really love when you tell me I'm using a non-existing method, but you're wrong here. No inspection for this line. And I've gotten multiple feedback multiple times from people say, like, why are you putting that comment in there? I don't like it. And I'm like, because it's useful. It lets me see a green check at the top corner. Otherwise, for this file, and I have to wonder, I have to explain myself over and over. So I'm actually thinking of making an MR just in the handbook because it's a much lower bar for getting it in, like, and starting like a JetBrains thing to say, I know you don't use this IDE, and maybe it would litter it up, but it's just a comment. It's okay. It makes JetBrains users out of the box life easier. Yes, I could disable this inspection. I don't want to do that because then that's not the out of the box experience for a new contributor who just opens the project in JetBrains. So like there's legit reasons, but like I have to explain that over and over. And there's like a lot of these in the remote dev stuff. So I'm like, okay, I think I'm gonna have to take the time to like put something in the handbook, which I've been putting up by like a whole JetBrains section that I can just point to that and say, you can't complain about this comment because it's in the handbook. Done.
And I would
That's
say
a great enhancement. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
No. Sometimes I do things that require some explanation at first because I'm like, oh, I like doing it this way.
I know that, Paul. I paired with you.
Sometimes I do things that require explanation. That goes without saying. That expands beyond coding for sure. But the explanation tampers down after a couple of reviews, and especially after, okay, this has become more of a solidified practice, either through documentation or acceptance. And that sounds great. I would highly just recommend writing a quick thing in the co-located JetBrains stuff of like, hey, and you can leave comments here. Sometimes JetBrains can pick something up, so everything's all green. Leave a comment like this, share it with everyone in the backend channel. And so now everyone knows, oh, it's okay to see comments like this. And like that, it takes a little bit of time before, okay, we're all familiar with this new thing. And I think that, yeah, when it comes to like, I would just highly recommend the best thing you can do to ensure positive review experience is two things. Is the self-review is really important. But you can't be like overly verbose about it. So you want to do a self-review and being a little choosy about not picking everything, but only highlighting the bits that you think are really kind of standing out, because the goal is to make it so easy for anyone looking at it to approve. And if you can't do that, then it's a pretty good signal to you of like, maybe something's off here. And I really want to collaborate with someone to get new ideas of how can I make this bit better. In addition to self-review, I've started like when I ping people, if it's authorization specific review or if it's a backend review, but the whole MR isn't backend, I'll ping them with context of, hey, can you review this? This is the main goal. The backend is doing this. Take a look at these comments. And like that goes a long way as well for reviewers to understand when they first get pinged too, how much what the block of work is in front of them when they see that email come in of like, oh, I got a new review, I got to do this thing. So I think self-review is a big deal, but also leaving context when you ping the person so that they know what they're kind of getting into.
So one more thing that is crossing my mind regarding rather on the edge stuff or new stuff. Like if I think about things that are currently in progress, like all of the AI stuff, new APIs whatsoever. So every once in a while you'll be finding yourself working on things that will not be in the handbook because they're just pretty much brand new. What helps me quite a bit, or what I've been using as a technique, is to really boil an MR down to a very, very much prototypey kind of stuff, and then actually loop in the reviewer in a very, very early stage and be like, this is kind of how it's supposed to look architecture-wise. Like it's missing a lot at the moment, and I'm aware of this, but in theory, would you be okay with this approach? Because it has like the key facts we can then discuss. And then later on add bells, whistles, unit tests, whatever you'll be needing. I thought this to be quite it's a little counterintuitive, but I thought it should be quite efficient for the author and the reviewer, because you're just keeping the scope as little as possible. So it's a little bit of more communication added, but since you're cutting down the scope, it could be helpful depending on the use case.
Cool. And yeah, as far as the self-review, I'm not good at reviews just in general. They're not something I've done a lot in my career. I've paired a lot, or before that, I worked at places that didn't have code review culture or minimal. So like even when I try to catch things, I don't. And that's even when I do know something, much less the things that I don't even know that there's some process or guideline that we have that I'm not aware of. So I feel I just waste people's time. Or when I do a review, I have this huge imposter syndrome that like the maintainer is going to look at it, is like, oh, Chad was it? God, how could have Chad missed these obvious things? Like he's not even caring. He's just rubber stamping this. And like when I look at the code, I've seen you do it, and I know there's ways to get better at it, but they don't jump out at me.
That's an interesting point. I think when what I find jumping out to me, like I want to leave a comment about this, is usually it's at the top of the module, and I say, like, what is this doing? And I kind of leave those comments. Sometimes I'll leave them as comments in the code. Sometimes they're not worth comments in the code, and I leave them as comments in the MR. And that's like the big thing, is like, this is a big unit. What is this unit doing? And why did I feel like we needed to create a new unit here? And I leave that comment a lot. And I don't find myself leaving, I don't leave nitpicky comments to myself. I'll just go fix them. I'm like, oh, I gotta do this thing, whatever. Like, but at the same time, it's like, go for the review as early as possible. If I see a nitpicky thing that could be changed, I like to leave it in there. This is me being strategic. I like to leave my, one line, this could be prettier, for a reviewer to catch. So then we're collaborating and we all feel like we've contributed. I don't have to do something perfect, and that's a way that we can collaborate and feel better about the thing that we're approving and looking at. So I
At least know you thought about it, even if you haven't done a good job of thinking about it.
yeah, but the top line comments, like this goes a long way for me. The top line comments I leave at like the beginning of a big function or the beginning of a class, of like, what is the responsibility of this thing, is those go a long way. So
what about like when you're actually doing a review? Like I'll often, like I try to at least exploratory test it and say, does this work? And then when I look at the code, like especially like I try to be full stack. So I have myself as a front end reviewer, but a lot of times I'll get it and I'm like, okay, I don't know, this looks good to me. I don't see anything obviously wrong. And then like the maintainer will catch, 3 or 4 things.
Front end is weird.
But I'll or even on the back end too, or like especially obscure things like GraphQL or stuff I'll miss, or how to refactor things. But like how bad should I feel about that? Just missing things as a review.
Very bad. Yeah, very, very, very bad. Yeah.
I do. That's good. Then I'm doing it right.
That's interesting. I don't know. That's a good.
I'm mostly like, do they have tests? Like my culture is like TDD and pairing. I'm like, do they have some tests for it? Do the tests look like they cover the main paths of what they're doing and maybe some exceptional cases? Okay, good. If it does and does it work, like I'll exploratory test it, and like that's my traditional bar. I'm like, okay, ship it. But that is not the bar at GitLab, is much higher than that. So that's the mismatch between the way I have learned to be a developer and what is expected here. It's like if there's something wrong with it, well, it'll get, if a linter doesn't catch it, if the explorer, if it does what it's supposed to do, and there's some decent looking tests, good. Anything else will get caught. But that's like not our bar. Our bar is much higher than that, it seems.
Speaking from front end, like view maintainability has some weird not compile time caught quirks with it. Like the way you have to manage state and reactivity and all of that is a different paradigm.
Why are there linters for all of that? Is it not possible, or we're too lazy, or what?
There's for some things, but for other things, it's just design decisions. And in reality, it's like, hey, we need to be more reactive with this rather than working off events. And there's no way to catch that unless you're really, really familiar with the tool you're using, Vue, and this is how we best use Vue. And this is the trade-offs with that. And this is where in these situations, it's not the way to do it. So for front end, I just say you should give yourself a pass with Vue is just weird. Like Vue.
There's things like that on the back end too. Like, for example, Vishal was like saying, do we really like this timestamp isn't always the same? I'm like, whatever, it's not a big deal. But then when I was like, well, fix the name. But when I looked at it, it was an N+1 error. It was an N+1 courier. And I was like, that was staring me right in the face. And I didn't even see it. That was dumb. But like, that's not something you can link for. So that's why I called him out. I was like, thank you for pushing me on this, Vishal. It was actually an N+1 performance error. And definitely should have been fixed. It wasn't just the timestamps were different.
Yeah, well, that's like the main thing with that's the main thing review is like it's like asynchronous pairing with questions. That's the best thing you can do. And if everyone's respecting each other's questions and we get down to it, we don't just write it off of like, hey, stop questioning my code and just merge it. Like, oh, okay, you don't even really want to collaborate here. That's so. If I think you've done really good both front end and back end reviews, Chad, where you may have identified there might be a gap in understanding on my part, but you're just still asking questions. That's like the best thing you can do.
Yeah, it's more like the obvious things I feel like I should be getting that I miss, or
It's hard. Like it's hard.
Absolutely.
What I do with reviewing is I check it out locally and I start changing it. And if I start changing it of like, okay, this is weird. Can we make it simpler? And it's like, oh yeah, this is how we could do it. And then I ask myself, okay, is this worth it? Am I being nitpicky here? It's oftentimes it's like, yeah, that's not a big deal. But as I start changing it, sometimes it's like, wow, we didn't even need this whole component. And so that's how I can review a bunch of new units in like 10 to 15 minutes because I'm really, really comfortable writing front end code. So it's like, okay, this is how I would have done it. It was like, all right, here's how we can review it.
yeah, and I'm pretty comfortable with Ruby, but like with Ruby, there's at least a half a dozen ways to do anything you want. And then like often the maintainer will simply like, why don't you just do this in one line instead of 5? And I'm like, oh yeah. Yeah, that's totally a thing we could have done. Missed that.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think getting back to it, don't feel bad if you get review comments. Everybody gets review comments. That means you're collaborating.
Yeah, it's mainly I don't want to like there is a we now have the inevitable deadline for RD, which is like a nice month, and there's like a ton of reviews to get through. So the cycle you said of like, yeah, it's an asynchronous collaborative pairing exercise. It's like, yeah, well, that's not all going to happen in the next month. And in any reality,
on the timetable, then yeah.
Let me
why I want to really have them as polished as possible. But back to my original question before I hand them over. But how do I know what that is?
Let me can I give to you a strategy to potentially make reviews less frictionful?
Please.
I would potentially see if you can find maintainers ahead of time.
Oh, we already doing that. We have a handful assigned.
And then I would assign them first to do a big gloss over of like, does this all kind of look okay? You don't have to detail review this, but does this kind of look okay? And that then sign it to the initial review with the context of the maintainer already said this large approach is okay. Can you do whatever initial review? That way, as you are looping in random initial reviewers, if that's the option or whatever, they understand that what the possible changes could be, and no one's going to throw a huge curveball in an MR.
Yeah, it makes sense. And we actually have like like 3 backend and 3 database reviewers, and then you and Enrique are the ones for the front end, and they're all maintainers. So hopefully,
yeah,
everybody will have context. There won't be anybody random. And as I get one thing, since we've done all this on the integration branch, as I find out one thing that I missed, I can go through the branch and make sure that I've fixed that everywhere else and may exist for future ones, because we'll be pulling chunks out of this integration branch for multiple MRs.
Yeah. Oh, what? Why is GitLab's telling me my Mac requires a security update? Friendly.
Oh, yeah, I did
GitLab.
last night.
Defer. Yeah, I'm gonna defer that nonsense. It's gone. It already left me. Oh well. All right.
The machine's about to reboot. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. This meta discussion is good stuff. Mostly just making me feel better. But
The initial review.
I have a lot of imposter syndrome around reviews here.
Uh-oh.
I'm like, I suck at it so much.
It's just an asynchronous pair programming exercise.
Yeah, but the thing about like it feels less when a pair calls me out on something, it feels less worse than it's because of the asynchronous nature. It's like, oh man, I wasted time and there's this whole loop. And now there's like, I've added a day to this by doing something dumb or by missing something like that. Whereas pair programming, by doing something stupid, you've added like 10 seconds and that's the feedback loop.
I know what you mean. Yeah. Do you ever do like mutation testing? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Fuzz testing?
Am I talking about fuzz testing? I don't know.
Are you talking about like coming up with random values within
No.
constraints? Oh, no.
The mutation testing is you change the production code and see if the tests fail, like if the test would have caught this.
Oh, yeah. Like, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that we don't have like, I know why we don't have it in GitLab, because that is a very high bar for code quality. It's hard to achieve that, but
yeah,
there are tools for Ruby. I think Reek is the one back in the day. I don't know if there's a cooler one.
Yeah, so it's like it's able to test the level of like it's a way of assessing coverage, but also just like the type of coverage that you have of like if I've replaced a variable with a you know null or false. So like, is this stuff still work? And coming from someone that does a lot of pair TDD, this is I highly recommend this method of testing, of reviewing the tests, knowing if they're good enough, because that's kind of a synchronous way for me to know like, hey, did we build this test suite, you know, respecting, you know, TDD principles where every little change has got to have a test around it. And if so often when I engage in this exercise, there's like chunks of view template that aren't caught in unit tests, and there's always stuff like
right. On the back end, that's a little bit better because there is pretty strict code coverage. Like you have to have 100% line, not branch, but line coverage, which kind of forces you to. Which that is sort of I didn't TDD a lot of this stuff on the Ruby side, but I did make sure 100% code coverage, and it's amazing what the bugs that catches. Like one line covered. Yep, there's a bug in that line. That just happened last week. The one line that was not covered.
I know, and that's such a funny thing with the tests of like, going that extra mile really does help what you've written itself. It's going to help your future self too, but it's funny how much testing helps at the initial development time. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
cool.
Well, thanks for this discussion.
Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate it, John. Yeah. I love code review. But I also understand like we do be nice if there wasn't as big of a feeling of friction as there is with it. And I think that's a interesting signal to be aware of like what causes people to feel friction with an MR.
Well, it's compounded by our async nature. So if like the person happens to be on the other side of the world, you're like, okay, there's at least a day cycle here, maybe more, depending on your schedules. And secondly, especially in the back end, it's like the GDK and just the size of it with the Ruby code. Like even if I want to run coverage locally, even if I want to run the test suite locally, like we're talking, I'm in for at least a half an hour to an hour, like just even for a minor change I need to fix. And then waiting the pipeline to run an hour, it's those things make the feedback loops even worse than they would be just if it were a fast test suite and a co-located team doing this sort of review QA.
Yeah. I was gonna say like initial reviews are optional. Like they're not the required, the maintainer is the only bit that's required. So when things have a tight deadline, sometimes just getting initial review from people within the same team is fine. You don't have to listen to DangerBot. So it's like all of the normal MR process isn't, a lot of those are suggestions, and when things have a deadline, we can be flexible with it.
Yeah. And like remote development, it's a greenfield feature. So I'm not sure if that means like, and we're definitely in MVC mode, we're like just get something out that minimally works to run the web IDE in it for the handbook. That's our goal. So I'm not sure if that means like the bar for the code quality, since it's greenfield, should be tend to be lower or tend to be higher. But the way I've architected it is like there's all of our plumbing and the GraphQL and the services and all of that stuff, but there's the creamy middle of all of the domain logic, which is just mostly pure Ruby stuff under the lib folder. So
yeah,
I've tried to like all of the standards and stuff should be like in the architectural tiers outside that layer. Does your service look right? Does your GraphQL look right? Does the database look right? Are the indexes right? But then in the middle of that, it's basically, this is just Ruby code and domain logic. So I'm hoping that at least it segregates, and we're planning on doing those things in separate MRs. So it will segregate the types of feedback that we get for the different MRs.
I think you answered though, like the question perfectly just right then of like, hey, the greenfield architecture should be solid. But sometimes there's going to be messy parts, and as long as those messy parts are just kind of put in a little architecture box, like that's great. I get nervous with new things introducing messiness because I think, this is how we got here with all this technical debt at GitLab. Don't do it again. But I think it's not, it's more about architecture. And my concern, I think, with new things that just like, we got to just get something out there and you have no architecture and everything's referencing everything and everything's coupled, it's like, this is going to grow out of hand. So
yeah, I explicitly avoided that, like loose coupling and high cohesion. Like that is my mantra in my software development life. And this definitely follows that. It's like, okay, here's the middle stuff with all of our domain logic. And then all of, the same like hexagonal or layered architecture and the ports and adapters, that's that same sort of thing. It's like, the middle talks to the database, but other than that, it mostly all of the tiers above that are as decoupled as possible from it.
That's another great comment, though, self-review comment to leave, is like when there's those parts of the code that we kind of don't like ourselves, and we know are a little messy, but we've put effort to contain them into a little box, leaving a comment of like, hey, I realize this is weird and there's a lot we could do to improve this. We're on a deadline and it's just here and it's tested. We're going to refactor later, but we got to get this thing out. Like that's
a great point, because we have like a whole docs repo dedicated to this that's got our architecture, but I should like, even though what I just said, I've told people like I should write that down and like link to it at the top of maybe every MR. Like this is the overall architecture here, and this is how we're decoupling this, and it's intentionally in a layered architecture, ports adapter style.
Yeah, and doing the best you can to like give every stakeholder in the MR an executive summary, not just read all of the documentation I've linked to you, because they won't. Just saying, hey, here's the point, you can look at it here. Like that goes so far. It always pays off. I'm speaking of hyperbole, so maybe not always pays off, but cool discussion, John.
Cool. That's great advice.
I thought it was Family and Friends Day. I didn't think anyone was going to show up. Every day is family day for me. So I'm that's why.
Yeah, I have a meeting with Enrique about the remote dev stuff like on the hour.
Okay.
So I showed up early for this.
Nice.
And wanted to chat about this. Thanks. It was some good feedback.
Cool. Well, that's great. Well, yeah, good luck with 16L.
I don't think you're going to get out of this one either, Paul. You're going to We gotta get sucked into this.
Oh no, you read between the lines. Yannick, do you have anything that's like 16:0 deadline that you're working on?
Not so much, fortunately. Yeah, luckily. There's nothing regarding the major version. Like there was business end of milestone stuff, but nothing that I know there are things, the deprecation and things are going on in my team, but I do have some distance to them, luckily. So nothing too complicated on my side.
That's good. Somehow, editor are we able to say the new group name? I assume so. It was all in public channels. The new group IDE team is
Yeehaw!
I know. Somehow we what was I gonna say? We always end up like having deadlines. I feel like we have a lot of deadlines for a team, a group, compared to other parts of GitLab.
Well, we've started. I've been pushing for the yesterday's weather-based agile approach, and we're breaking down the small issues and estimating them. So if we get everything that we know we want to be in this release broken down and we weight it, like we already have our velocity is 12.5. Like I can come up with a quantifiable number that says we should make this or we're not going to make this. What do you want to cut? Rather than the arbitrarily imposed deadline driven method planning.
Wise. That's really wise. I was really impressed when you were able to calculate the velocity. I was like, man, that's powerful knowledge. It's really interesting.
The volatility is very high. So like it's comes with a huge caveat. We're like 25 the first week, 5 the second. It's like, yes, that's the pretty high volatility there.
Oh no, if you tell Eric, well, hey, we can only do 15. Eric's like, well, what about that one week you did 25? Could we get one of those weeks again?
No, Eric doesn't do that.
I know he wouldn't. That's funny. Well,
he shields us from that, if anything.
Yeah. Do you all have any MRs that you want to pair on or any other topics? Or
I'm just scrolling through something, if you folks wouldn't mind, and let me just tell you about it in a second. So I just a couple of minutes ago, I got assigned an MR to review. It is massive, and I've just been scrolling through it. Don't know much about it, what's actually going on, but what I just figured was like, okay, interesting. It has some changes to startup SCSS committed, which is fine. I'm hoping it's auto-generated, but that's what I'm assuming.
it is auto, yeah. The will fail if it's not auto-generated.
Yeah.
Startup CSS is like the pot files.
Gotcha. The thing is, the changes in there are looking really, really interesting to me, and interesting as if in buggy. So whatever this am changing, this is what we came up to add on startup CSS, which is 2 empty media queries.
Yeah, that's weird.
Do agree. And it looks like to me that this is probably calling us.
Super sidebar. Or super sidebar is nearby. I think I know what's going on.
I've got an idea. Can I give it a shot first?
Sure.
I think that like there's some automatic thing creating these things, and it's probably taken all the media queries that are existing in account or something, and it's like, yeah, basically. Okay, I don't really know. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're good. Can we jump to the? Oh, so there's the super sidebar thing there.
This one?
Wait, though I'm looking at the changes to the framework super sidebar. Can we scroll up on that one? Oh, scroll down. No, sorry. I just meant the whole file, the super sidebar .css.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It is the and not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if we can we expand the rest of the file from the top of this super sidebar thing? Yeah. Prefers reduced motion. What an interesting, man. CSS web specs, they go deep, man.
Well, I get I get the first reduced motion media query, and I think it's a good feature. What I love most about it is that it says like no preference. So why even bother? Okay, well, we'll be so kind and ask people, but just if they don't care, then we're gonna be doing this.
Right. I have a feeling it's related to the not, which is why for some reason it's. Can we go down a little bit more? Okay. And then if we go down to what's showing up in the CSS. So we get these just completely empty ones. It's possible that we are I think page with super sidebar. Oh, yeah, something weird's going on there. At the same time, it's like startup CSS isn't super important, but it could be a sign of something's off with the actual CSS that we're generating. I have a feeling that something's probably off with our startup CSS. The script that generates this thing.
Do agree. What would be the sorry?
No, keep going.
What would be the takeaway, like from me as a reviewer, as if in like it's definitely not like this is nothing to bother the author with, because it's like that is auto-generated, that thing. So it's basically probably opening an issue for the startup CSS with a link to it, but I can see this being quite a pain to reproduce. But that is probably a part of the solution for the.
Well, I would ask a question here. I would say this is really weird. Is everything working as expected? I would ask a question on why are these media queries empty? And yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, let's do it like that. I'm kind of afraid that I already know the answer from the author, which basically will be saying like, no idea, it's auto-generated.
Well, then, so, you know, at least you asked. Right?
Well, yeah, great.
Because if we were pairing on this, you're asking it right now. Let's just ask it transparently, so everyone can see the question of like, this is weird. But
fair point.
It's up to you if you want to say it's up to you if you want to say it's blocking or non-blocking, like, and or just if you want to say this is a non-blocking question, or this is a question with alongside the other things. And
yeah, I would probably go with it's a non-blocking thing, but I would hope I would want to see a follow-up on this, like that we so that we don't lose it.
Yeah,
that's probably what I'd be going with.
Yeah, it's very weird. Do we have any other media queries? And so let's take a look at something real fast, because I got nerd sniped by this just now. I gotta figure this out. what happened with the media min width 1200 pixel one? And how come that? Do you see on line 1486? So this is a media query that is working. So my question is,
I've got an idea what's going on.
yeah,
Nothing more than an idea, but in the media query, in here, we are looking in transition, we're speaking about transitions, which doesn't make sense. But I would argue that maybe the transition key is never considered in critical any startup CSS.
I think you're totally right.
If there would be a border or whatever in here, it probably would have made it. So we are probably including media queries into startup CSS as long as they exist, no matter what. We're not checking if they're empty or not. We are checking the keys in there if they're important enough, and transitions probably don't qualify. That's more or less educated guess.
I think you're 100% correct. Yeah.
Interesting stuff. Yeah,
No,
probably
I
not.
added a link. Did you see the link I sent in the chat?
Not yet. Here we go. Yep.
So, I mean, this code is really old, and it comes from, this algorithm comes from the original startup CSS generator, which was a separate was like a separate project altogether. But see, git remove testers, and one of the things we're testing for is if the prop is transition. So we don't need to include transitions in startup CSS.
Yep.
And so, but the reason why then you don't see the class references, if you go down to get empty nodes to remove, we look for, apparently we're able to look for empty like selectors.
Yeah.
And remove those, but we're not able to look for empty media queries somehow.
Oh my God. Okay. Honestly, I wish I wouldn't have found this. Because like I get it, like that's spot on. That is what we're looking at. But that will probably be quite a pain to fix. And if we get it fixed in this script, the outcome of it will be saving 4 lines in our startup CSS. So that's quite a tedious job, but
this is true. But like sometimes, like I would just, you can create the issue. No one here has to take care of it. This is a bug with startup CSS. So
absolutely,
I would just create the issue. Yeah, that's an interesting. That's really interesting.
Yep, that was what's coming from my mind. I don't know why. I usually skim through those startup CSS changes.
Yeah, it's a big deal because it can show, even if sometimes if we use SCSS like the ampersand thing incorrectly, it can cause an explosion of selectors that we're not aware of. So it's like, it's really helpful to see it. Yeah, this is a bug.
Let me rephrase that. I actually know why I'm skimming through those startup CSS files, since I'm aware how critical or about the high prioritization we're loading them with. So that is our superstar, more or less. So you really want to make sure that there's nothing odd in there. So therefore, that's where it's coming from.
Yeah. Ideally, we can get rid of it. Like we don't. Be great to get rid of startup CSS. If our CSS was small enough that we could just, or if we did things differently, or maybe it's not.
Yeah, bundling would be a great approach at first.
Yeah, Simon. I know that he's really wants to. He's trying to conduct some research to invalidate startup CSS's existence, and so that that'd be great.
Absolutely. It is, yeah, it's a band-aid solution, that's for sure.
Yes. This is better than the previous band-aid. The previous band-aid, it was all checked in and not auto-generated.
It was hand-made, hand-tailored stuff.
We had a script on a separate project that generated it.
Awesome.
But it wasn't ever updated. And one of the gnarliest things that would happen is
Flickering.
you would try to remove a rule,
Mhm.
but startup CSS includes that rule. And so your production CSS and the startup CSS are out of sync, and startup CSS is overwriting things and they're conflicting with each other. Very, very gnarly stuff happens.
Worse than flickering. Okay, I see.
But
Uh,
now it's all auto-generated, so we're a little better.
Yep. Yeah, I remember that. I definitely remember the introduction of the auto-generated solution. Not so much don't remember running into issues with
Yeah.
the prior solution. But yep.
Well, no, thanks for asking that. Thanks for asking that problem. So what I did a project-wide search for transition, and then in files to include, I did startup, and it showed that line of code of like, oh yeah, we're filtering out transition stuff in startup CSS. So
Good call.
that's how I think you had the idea of like, yeah, maybe transitions aren't important in startup CSS. I was like, oh, I think you're right. So it's like, okay, yeah. So,
One day in one of those sessions, we need to be speaking about regex in VS Code. I feel like I can learn a lot from you that area.
oh, nice. Yeah. Well,
That'd be amazing.
more regex. Everyone loves reading regex. So I just highly recommend
Absolutely.
adding as much regex as possible to your MRs. I was a little offended that people like, even if I just add regex and it's straightforward, people don't want it because they're like, regexes grow out of, they become unmaintainable. But I like regex.
I've recently been in a situation where I had an MR which two people reviewed, and I had a non-regex solution for something, and the first reviewer asked me to add a regex to this. I'm not comfortable with giving any names here. And the second reviewer actually came in and let's definitely not do this with a regex. So sometimes as the author, you kind of feel in between the lines. So that happens as well.
I know.
That's okay.
Yeah. Oh well. All right. Well, cool. Thanks everyone for
Gotcha.
hopping on. This is fun. Appreciate it.
See you then.
I'll catch you all next time. Bye.
See you.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.